Let's hear some of the good news and perhaps the bad news then from William Smith, who's got the key findings of the 2018 General Report and Gender Review.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction. I want to thank the organizers again, as well as our partner on the Gender Review, Ungai, for helping us put this together. This is our global launch day. So we're launching the Gender Review here, as well as in New York, and then I'll be in Paris talking with UNESCO shortly. The Gender Review follows from our 2017-18 main Global Education Monitoring Report, which this year focused on accountability in education. So for our Gender Review, we're talking about how do actors, not just the government, but also teachers, schools, parents, community members, how are they held accountable for meeting commitments towards gender equality in education? So in the post-2015 world, when we're focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals, it's clear that sustainable development cannot happen without gender equality. However, as education is essential for meeting all the Sustainable Development Goals, gender equality also needs to be achieved in education. The Gender Review this year looks at gender equality to education and through education. So when we're thinking about these dimensions of to and through education, we recognize that to monitor progress on gender equality, it's not enough just to look at numbers. You can't just disaggregate by boys and girls. So we also need to look at the values, norms, and attitudes of the community. We need to look at laws and policies in place that may be discriminatory. We need to look at how resources are allocated and who has decisions over those allocations. And also look at teaching and learning practices. So we're going to start by looking at some of the numbers and looking at some progress and looking at some challenges before we look at some of the policies around accountability. So I want to say briefly that everything I'll go through here is in the report, and I know some of you got here before me. I apologize for that. There are now copies of the report in the back, so please do grab them on the way out. So we're going to start off with looking at gender disparities. And when you look at this, first, one statistic that goes out all the time is that, globally as a world we've met gender parity, which is true. If you look at the average across the world and you look at primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary, you see that globally we've met gender parity. But when you look at the country level, it's a different story. So at the country level, 66% of countries have met gender parity in primary, 45% in lower secondary, 25% in upper secondary, and only 4% in tertiary. Now there's some good stories on this graph, and this is kind of a neat graph, so I'm going to walk you through this a little bit. So first, the big gray bars here are the measure of gender parity. Okay, so that's the percentage of countries that have met gender parity at different education levels. There's two bars representing 2000 and 2015. So generally we want to see what we're seeing here, which is a widening of the bars across time, meaning more countries are meeting gender parity. And when you look across all the different levels, you see that yes, we're moving towards gender parity. It might be slow, but it's happening. So some of the interesting things, so you can see from primary to tertiary, all the bars are starting to drop kind of down on the graph. Okay, what that means is that we're actually seeing gender parity, the shifts in gender parity across education levels are to the disadvantage of boys, or to the advantage of girls. Right? And we look at tertiary, we see, okay, now there's finally this gray bar, which that's the 4% of tertiary that's at gender parity, so that's great. And we can see the top, which is this orange bar, being basically a male advantage in tertiary. The bottom, which is the blue bar, being a female advantage in tertiary. And so we see that almost an overcorrection in place here, where we see actually a widening advantage for males to some extent a widening advantage for females to some extent, while gender parity advantaging males is decreasing. So, I can go over that more later. Okay, so within each of those levels, it's interesting to look by economic level of the country. So when we break down countries by their GPI, we see some interesting patterns. So first, when we look at the lowest income countries, we see that the disparity, this is upper secondary, but this is true in all levels. We see disparities at the expense of girls in the lowest income countries. And as you move to the higher income countries, the disparity at the expense of girls decreases, and we have the disparity that remains really at the expense of boys, where the parity numbers are increasing as we get to higher income. So at other education levels, the disparity at expense of boys and high income isn't as great. You have more at parity. But you always, at these lower income countries, have a large remaining amount of disparity at the expense of girls. Okay, this graph looks at the disparities by subject. So we're looking at tertiary education first. So we break down tertiary education more. Okay. Basically, this is the share of females on the y-axis. Okay. This is 50%. Right? Share of female. Oh, sorry. Yeah, backwards. This is tertiary. So this line represents 50% of females going to higher education or tertiary education. Okay. So you can see in some countries we still have less than 40% of tertiary graduates are female, but in most countries we have a larger percentage of graduates that are female. The difference is the line up here, and this is gender parity by STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, and math. So if we had an equal number of female graduates in tertiary, and now they were equally represented in STEM, we'd have basically the intersection there would be where all the countries are. What we're seeing here is that although, so the big bottom right quadrant, although most countries have over 50% female graduates in tertiary education, very few have over 50% graduates in STEM fields. So that includes Algeria, where 67% of tertiary graduates from STEM fields are female. Disparities also exist in leadership positions in schools and beyond. So for example, in October 2017, 11 of 193 heads of states were female, and 12 heads of government were female. When we look at parliament, and the composition of parliaments, in all regions outside of the Nordic countries, female representation in parliaments was less than 30%. We look at international organizations, including the UN and UNESCO. Women are underrepresented in the more senior fields. This is also true in aid agencies like DFID and DFAT and USAID. So for example, in Australia, in DFAT, 34% of senior executive staff and only 27% of heads of mission were female. We're seeing up here, this chart is even within schools, although females tend to dominate the teaching profession, we look at school leadership, they're much more likely to be male. So one extreme example of this is Japan, where approximately 40% of teachers in Japan are female, but less than 10% of school heads are female. We look within the profession, we see that there's still a difference between frontline workers and those that have the ability to shape knowledge and norms. So this graph looks at the agricultural section. And we know that overall, women represent about half of the agricultural sector. But on the x-axis here, you can see the female share of agricultural researchers. And in almost all countries, that's less than half. So education also influences preventable behavior against non-communicable disease. So education can work as a risk factor or a social vaccine, and how it works in a country varies by context and varies by time. So smoking is the leading preventable cause of death globally. So 6.4 million associated deaths were recorded in 2015. So we can see here lower and middle income countries, and on the right side, upper middle and high income countries, regardless of the income level, education is actually associated with less tobacco use. National mass media and social media campaigns can make a difference, but we should be doing targeting that's gender sensitive. So this is, I guess, a smart targeting to almost counteract some of the marketing done by tobacco companies. So in Gambia, for instance, only 3% of adult women smoke, but 37% of adolescent females smoke. So in Indonesia, marketing is done towards males who have one of the highest shares of male smoking in the world, and drawing on ideas of masculinity. Okay. So now we're going to get into, now we've seen a little bit of the state of gender equality. We're going to get into some of the accountability pieces. So accountability, accountability can be understood as a process that helps individuals or institutions meet their responsibilities and reach their goals. But what those responsibilities are may differ by how we understand gender. So in this report, we try to talk about what gender is, what gender does, and what gender aims for. And generally, when we're talking about monitoring gender in education, we're limiting ourselves to what gender is. Okay? Which is really talking about gender parity ratios. Even when we break down SDG 4, all the times we're talking about disaggregated data by males and females, and we're still just talking about measuring things by gender parity. So if we think about and limit our thinking to what gender is, then reaching parity and participating rates and learning outcomes by sex is the focus of accountability. And once we've reached those gender parity measures, we're done. We've accomplished our goal, and that's it. If we move one step beyond that, we can talk about what gender does. So this is part of a changing process for gender equality in education. And here, accountability structures would scrutinize the underlying power processes in education. Finally, the broadest aim actually requires some type of longitudinal understanding of how education really transforms society. So if we're talking about what gender aims for, then we should be redirecting accountability towards transformative change that actually advances women's rights over time. So how we understand gender may drive some of our accountability measures and how we evaluate education. But gender equality in education, however, starts from the government, and we have to understand what is the government committed to. So with help from a background paper from the Right to Education Initiative, which is thankfully in the room, we started looking at how many countries have fully committed to gender equality. So we looked at how many countries have committed to gender equality in international human rights treaties, specifically looking at 3 treaties. So the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, the Convention Against Discrimination in Education, or CAD, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, as CEDAW is the preeminent treaty around women's rights, we consider those least committed to those that have not done anything to ratify CEDAW. So that 4% represents 7 countries, including Iran, Niue, Palau, Somalia, Sudan, Tonga, and the United States. The most committed are those that have fully ratified all 3 of those treaties. And then sections 2 to 5 are various combinations depending on did you have reservations with CEDAW and did you ratify both or one of the other treaties. So reservations are a big deal. So 189 states have ratified CEDAW, but that doesn't mean all states that have ratified CEDAW have fully committed to gender equality in education. So our analysis shows that 27 states have made 44 reservations in CEDAW that could affect the right to education for girls and women. The most common is Article 16, which sets out the rights for women with respect to marriage and family life. 20 countries have had reservations for such an article. So now that you've committed, how do you put it into practice? So credible education plans are important. The plans need to be clear, with obvious lines of responsibility. They need to be properly costed. Out of 42 education sector plans analyzed by the Global Partnership for Education, they classified 25 plans as gender sensitive. Or it can't just be the plan. A gender lens is needed at all points in the education policy and planning cycle. So we start at the top here, actually, with planning and policy making. There needs to be an ex-ante gender assessment and to make gender responsive education plans, which means before you put in place a policy, you should be doing an analysis of how is that going to affect males and females. Is there going to be a differential effect? Currently, many countries are doing ex-ante assessments, including Belgium, France, Mexico, and Iceland. Then you need to talk about gender budgeting. So it should be analyzing the budget from a gender perspective. To date, over 80 countries have tried at some point some type of gender budgeting. In 2016, only 12 of the 36 OECD countries are using gender budgeting. Once we've created the plan, costed the plan out, then we need to talk about how is it being implemented and review progress. So this should be a multi-stakeholder effort. So the Global Partnership to Education has promoted joint sector reviews as one way to review education sector plans. The idea behind joint sector reviews is to bring multiple stakeholders together, including community, civil society, government, parents, teachers associations, and discuss progress towards meeting goals set out in the education sector plans. However, when we're reviewing joint sector reviews, in only 20% of those meetings, 26% of those meetings, is the minister or Ministry of Social Affairs or gender represented. Finally, after we reviewed it, we need to share those reports with the public. So this includes creating a national monitoring report. However, based on our main report, only 1 in 2 countries have had a national monitoring report for education since 2010. And only 1 in 6 countries globally have an annual education monitoring report. Uganda is an interesting example of an effective report. So Uganda has disaggregated data by sex at all education levels. They have a specific section for gender that then focuses on policy concerns, what interventions have been in place, and what progress they've made towards their plan. When we talk about gender equality to education, there are multiple laws in place that prevent access still. The 2016 Right to Education Index, which covered 15 countries, found that the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Tanzania, out of those 15 countries, had the most discriminatory environment for girls. To encourage parents to provide equal access to boys and girls, oftentimes countries have put in place truancy laws. However, truancy laws have been shown not to be very effective and typically are disproportionately harming mothers, as they are the primary caregivers in single-parent homes. Conditional cash transfers, where you're providing funding to encourage parents and overcome opportunity costs for education, have shown to be effective, especially for raising enrollment rates for girls. For instance, in Bangladesh, eligible girls saw their education increase by 2.7 years. One way to encourage girls to attend is to make sure we have single-sex or sex-separated sanitation facilities. Around 1 in 10 girls in Africa miss school during menstruation because of inadequate sanitation facilities. At a minimum, to overcome some of these areas of access, we should have regulations. So the regulations should include gender issues as well. And our analysis of regulation showed that 61%, in countries, in about 70 countries, 61% had regulations for sex-separated facilities in public schools. However, when you look beyond regulations and looked at data for 44 countries, only 9 of those, so only 9 of the 44 countries had 75% of the schools that actually had sex-segregated or sex-separated facilities in place. So when you have regulations, part of the reason this falls behind is because we don't have proper inspections. So inspection should include gender issues in the inspection, and this is the case in Sweden and the United Kingdom. However, inspectorates are often resource constrained. So for instance, in one district in Tanzania, although 80% of schools are supposed to be monitored annually, only 20% are. Additionally, we should have comprehensive sexuality education. So, and nearly 80% of 45 countries had policies in this favor. Within comprehensive sexuality education, it's important to understand what are the power dynamics. And so sexuality education that took into account power dynamics was actually 5 times more likely to be effective than those that failed to. Our figure in this slide is from Kenya. And here we look at the difference between what students in the classroom want to learn in sexuality education and what their report actually have learned. So you can see the large gap between all, but in the middle of this is contraceptive methods. And so we can see that students in Kenya, out of students in Kenya, only 1 in 5 report learning something about contraceptive methods. We look at gender equality through school. Once you get through the doors, you can really highlight how all actors are really interdependent of each other. So we talk about, once we get into the school doors and who's responsible for ensuring a safe and supporting learning environments, the school has a role to play, government still has a very big role to play, but also teachers and students. So both for meeting professional norms and providing good behavior. Two key parts of meeting gender equality in education are unbiased textbooks and providing sensitive teaching methods. Over the past 50 years, we've seen an increase in the mention of women's and women's rights in textbooks. However, still, women are underrepresented and tend to be portrayed in stereotypical roles. The limited success of programs for teacher education and training in Uganda and Nigeria show that if we're going to have teacher training to try to overcome some of these stereotypes and biases that are present within the classroom, it can't be a piecemeal effort. It needs to be continuous, long-term training to overcome some of these stereotypes, and it needs to include stakeholders beyond the school so that motivated teachers aren't dismayed once they move out into the community and they're told that they're doing the wrong thing. So it needs to be a community-wide effort. So there's obviously a lot more in our review than what I have an opportunity to go over today, but here are some of the main recommendations. So if we're trying to look at gender equality in education, if we're serious about this, first we need to identify and remove gender barriers. So this needs to be a holistic approach, we talked earlier, addressing laws, institutions, and policies both in and outside of school. So this might include revoking laws that discriminate. As mentioned earlier, there are still countries that ban pregnant girls from attending school. In Tanzania, 8,000 girls are expelled annually because they're pregnant. And we need to instill whole school reform. This might include teachers' codes of conduct. And research across 24 countries, teachers reported, over 50% of teachers reported that the code of conduct in their schools reduced misconduct of teachers. We also need to hold people to account for gender equality in education. As I said before, this starts with government, who's the primary duty bearer for education. Individuals and civil society submission of complaints are important. For instance, in our report, we highlight that individuals can actually provide individual complaints to international human rights treaties without needing a lawyer. A robust women's movement domestically is also important. Countries that have a strong women's movement and have ratified international treaties have been shown to be more progressive in their policy change. Additionally, using gender quotas can help expand leadership positions. In a study of over 100 countries, those that had gender quotas in place had more than 5 percentage points higher female representation in their leadership for the government. And finally, we're encouraging all countries to produce an annual education monitoring report. So accountability requires all of our efforts. We need to be able to move beyond simple parity ratios to see gender equality in and through education, and we need to support of the community. So please help me get accountability right by joining our campaign, Who's Accountable, and tweet us at the Gem Report. So thank you all for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.